I'm going to start right now with somebody who's also one of our artists of the month, and so excited about being able to have his art in the Capitol. So make sure that you stop by my office, 509, to see it. And without further ado, here's Broderick Flanagan.
Yes. Hello, everybody. I am Broderick Flanagan. I'm actually not representing an organization today. I'm actually coming just as a citizen. You know, I work with various organizations in the community, and I just want to put it out there that I'm not representing any one of those organizations that I am affiliated with today. But I definitely want to talk a little bit about some of the advocacy work that I've been doing in relation to some progressive groups that I have, like I said, been affiliated with. You know, I've done some work around living wages on a local level with some progressive groups, especially the Economic Justice Coalition. They've been in that fight for living wages, advocating for that for a while now. And other groups started to pick up that momentum and really going to mayor commission meetings and speaking at the podium about the need to increase wages. And we know on the local level, you can only, you can't set a, living wage or, mandate that for the private sector. But for the county employees, we were able to advocate for that. And they did raise that, minimum wage to $11.60 for some of those county employees. That only affected about 85 or so employees. But that was some work that I was involved in directly, like going to press releases, press conferences. Sometimes it was only 5 of us showing up, but we were there and we were advocating and making sure that it stayed on their radar and that they did not let it go by the side. So that was some of the work I've done, and I also had workers' rights workshops at my studio space. I invited in, I think his name is John Beasley, a lawyer that does workers' rights advocacy. He's out of Watkinsville, I believe. But another group, like I said, I'm affiliated with, they set up a workers' rights workshop, and it was hosted right there in my studio in the Triangle Plaza area. And he talked about, what happens when you get discriminated against, on the job? What are your rights? What are your legal things that you can do? And it was just a way to educate people when they run into issues like that on the job. It wasn't directly related to living wages, but that's just some of the examples of the advocacy I've done around, workers' rights or living wages and whatnot. So,
thank you.
Yeah.
Hey everybody, I'm Jesse Evans. I'm representing Economic Justice Coalition. I teach government and civics at Cedar Shoals High School, and I'm also on the board of elections. I'm not representing those organizations here today, but I'm speaking from my experiences as a teacher of government and civics at a Title I public school here in Athens, Georgia. EJC has been around for, as Broderick said, a long while. Our executive director, Linda Lloyd, joined in 2003, and she's been doing some great work for a really long time in Athens, Georgia, not the least of which is voter registration. So EJC has registered over 14,000 voters in Athens, Georgia. If we are to really pursue and achieve economic justice, it's important that we put the right people in positions of power to make that happen. So I'm a firm believer, specifically as somebody who teaches government civics, but also as someone who's elected. I was chosen to be on the board of elections, and I'm with this great group of people at EJC. I'm very passionate about voter registration, voter education. EJC is focused on education, advocacy, and organizing for jobs that pay a living wage and that also provide benefits to the employees. We're very passionate about pursuing a $15 minimum wage or joining that fight, and that's been going on for a while. Also, something that we're concerned about is the wage of tip workers here in Athens, Georgia. Where I'm from, in Kentucky, originally, when I was a server at a couple different restaurants, if I didn't make minimum wage, my employer would make up the difference in my check. That's not the case here in Georgia. I was really shocked when I was at a local establishment and the servers told me that a couple of years back. I actually had to do I was like, hold on, you sure about that? I got on the phone, did some research, and sure enough, it's pretty terrible policy in Georgia. These employers are not required to make sure that their employees are making even the minimum wage, much less a living wage. So that's something that we really need to fix. So I'm really pleased to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak on these things. And I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Great.
Yes, sir.
So again, we're going to have to do some of this manual, or it's going to fall.
There we go. We're back.
Or it's
we're
going
back.
to fall. This is live, folks. This is how we're trying to get this done. But as you can see, we are making it happen and not letting anybody stop this conversation, not even the technology.
Or gravity, not even gravity.
We also have somebody else who's joining us, Shannon Reese from Jobs with Justice, and that's part of the technicality that we're having a problem of trying to get her on. And Avery's going to continue to try that, but we want to make sure that she is also, that you know that she is also here with us. And so the first thing that I want to really do is, let's get everybody on the same page as to what as to what we're really talking about when we say living wage. What does that mean? Because I think sometimes, when you say, okay, it's $15 an hour, people sort of get that. It's $15 an hour, right?
Yeah.
If we talk about minimum wage, people get that. And unfortunately, right now in Georgia, minimum wage is only $5.15 an hour.
Right.
And that's our Georgia state minimum wage. It is the lowest. We're tied with Wyoming right now as the lowest minimum wage. And we are below the federal minimum wage, which is $7.50. Okay. And Shannon was telling me that this is a minimum wage that has not been raised in Georgia since 2001. And the federal minimum wage was raised in 2009. So that's still 9 years ago, right? And in Georgia, that's almost 17 years. I can tell you that every year Democrats have put in bills to try to raise the minimum wage here in Georgia. Okay, so when we talk about minimum wage, I think people get what that is, right? It's the least amount of money that they can pay you per hour. But what is a living wage? What are we trying to talk about and figure out? And, and then the second part of the question is, why is a living wage better than a minimum wage? So I'm going to start with you, Broderick. What's a living wage?
Yeah, I mean, first off, I want to kind of just give a little bit of framing context, and also thank you for having this important conversation. What you're doing with having conversations like this is you're better informing the citizens like myself. You're creating a more informed voter, pool, and I really appreciate that. Definitely, I wish more people were following in suit. But for me, the definition of a living wage is, a wage in which a person can experience the fullness of our society, participating in every aspect of that, meaning being able to take care of their necessities, but then also be able to afford a lawyer if something happens, or if somebody in their family gets sick or illness, to be able to, take care of that. And I've seen the things from the MIT calculator about living wages and what that means. And I get that with how they come up with that number, but is that adequate though? Is that enough? Is $15 an hour enough to really support yourself, even if you don't have any children? Can you go on vacation? Can you just experience those things that people that are making an adequate wage are able to participate in? For me, that's kind of how I frame living wages. And when you think about it, African Americans are usually at that bottom rung. Like when you look at the statistical data and you break it down by race, you find African Americans typically skewed towards the bottom of that that graph. And that's some of the advocacy work that I've been doing. Work that really kind of brings them, African Americans, into the fold of the economic development processes and the wages. That's why it's so important for us to set a higher minimum wage, because that affects everybody, or a living wage.
I really love the way that you put it, this idea that it's a wage so that everybody can fully participate. right, in society. Because I think sometimes people think, well, I want to get paid because I have to pay my bills, I have to pay groceries. But the other part of that, as you say, is that by them buying their groceries, by them getting the things for their kids, by them paying their bills, they are participating, right? And this is about making sure that everybody has that access and opportunity to participate. And we're going to talk a little bit later about the intersectionality of race and the living wage and, you know, some of the economic inequality that we actually started a conversation with Professor Mirza Baradaran last time. And I think all of this sort of comes together because you can't leave a piece of it out. Right? I think that's important as well. So from an economic justice point of view, right? Because people say, okay, I get the economics. What do you mean by economic justice in the living wage?
So my understanding and our understanding of the living wage is basically paying a person for their work at a level of wage that allows them to buy their food, their housing, their clothing, childcare, healthcare, like all of these things, and have a quality of life that is acceptable in our society. The minimum wage, it only allows for like a very basic purchasing of food. For example, the living wage actually would provide more money for that. So to compare minimum wage to living wage, I read recently that in order to actually have a living wage, or to make the amount of money that would be considered satisfactory and like acceptable in our society, and treating people with dignity, and allowing people to not just like live to work, right, but work to live. A person would have to work about roughly four full-time jobs at the minimum wage to make the living wage. I mean, I have students. Most of my students at the school that I teach, they qualify for free reduced lunches, which means that they're living at or below the poverty level, and that's not their fault. They're born into this, right? And their parents. A lot of these kids, their parents were born into that as well. It's a generational poverty. So I don't know, for me personally, but also for EJC, living in the wealthiest nation in the world, right? But also the nation that has the greatest disparity in wealth and income, like that's a problem, right? We have, and it becomes especially problematic when you're considering, as Broderick mentioned, that women and racial and ethnic minorities are disproportionately impacted by poverty. And then if you get specific to this community, 1 in 3 people in Clark County lives in poverty. 1 in 3 lives in poverty, which is, to me, shocking. I mean, it's a college town. It's the flagship university of the state. And so that's not acceptable. And this needs to be changed.
Yeah. So, you know, when Shannon, and I'm going to put this since we don't have her picture, so that, you know, her organization, Leads Jobs with Justice, you know, she brought a group of women into my office, and we were talking about, they were telling me their stories and how many of them working full time, but at minimum wage, they just can't make ends meet. And I had one mother there who was crying because she says, you know, she has 3 teenagers who, instead of being able to focus on school, focus on what they need to, have got to go and work just to help the family make ends meet. And she feels guilt over, you know, being the mother, not being able to provide. But it's not like she's lazy, right? It's not like she's doing or not doing what she's supposed to do. She's out there working 2 jobs on top of raising her family, you know. And Broderick mentioned this MIT living wage calculator, and we'll make sure that we post the link to this on Facebook. And I think what's interesting is we always have to take statistics with a grain of salt, right? Because statistics can sometimes mean anything we want it to mean on this. But there was something on this calculator that I looked at, and it said, even at $13 an hour, a single parent with 2 kids that's poverty at $13 an hour. Okay. And so you look at that and you say, okay, there's an issue here. And I think you touched on it on the generational. I think, Broderick, you were talking about the race. So let's bring in some of what Dr. Baradaran was talking about as well to this conversation, is this idea, if somebody is born in poverty, what are their real chances of moving out of there? Right. And how do we do that? Because the statistics are dismal. The statistics say, that less than 1 out of 4 children born in poverty are even going to make it to the lower middle class. Okay. So when you talk about those generations, Broderick?
I mean, you definitely got to look at some of the programs that were created under the New Deal with FDR, and how he was able to create programs, and legislate it, and with the WPA program in the 1930s, he was able to create, what they were able to create through that program, over a span of about 8 years, somewhere in the tune of like 8.5 million jobs. And they put people to work, and it was a federally funded, work program. So, that's how you really tackle and address this. And I know that we're talking about federal stuff, but we're in the state. But you can, advocate for those things and lobby, for those things, and put out information on the importance of programs like that are supported by the government and creating those jobs on a federal level, and it trickles down from there, then they get funds.
Well, I don't know about trickling. I don't aspire to the trickle down economics kind of a thing. But, I think where I was going, though, with that. What you're getting at, I think, is very, very important, right? Is that first we need to acknowledge, hey, there is this issue that is happening right now. And 2, that it is systemic.
Yes.
Right? That this is not something that just happened by happenstance. There were policies put in place. I mean, when you talk about FDR, one of the things, and I loved Mirsa's book because she goes through the history, right? And she shows how policy, the role of government, right, in bringing us to this situation that we're in now. And I think it really does show the reason why government has to be involved in the solution.
Right. And that's what kind of where I was going with that conversation, and looking at how those policies and that were created kind of locked a certain group of people out of participating in that, in those programs, and especially when the housing, market was created, and FHA, and how, those loans were federally insured by banks. And they weren't allowed access, though, to African Americans through those loans. And that is what ultimately created the wealth for a certain group of people. But then you have African Americans that are locked out of that system. Then you got the segregation, Jim Crow laws and all of that. And so all that kind of played into effect on how, things transpired over the years with that, wealth creation or job creation program. And that's what she really lays out in her book. And she does an excellent job of, taking you through a historical timeline almost of, the key program policies, key players that were essential in creating that, and how, Black, formerly enslaved Africans or African Americans were, kind of scrambling, trying to figure out how do we get out of this, position that we're in, how do we participate in America, in American society, and, that's kind of what has transpired over the years. We're still trying to figure that out, right?
And I think, Linda Lloyd at the Economic Justice Coalition, I know one of her ways of broaching this is this idea of voter registration, getting people involved in the political environment as well, right? Because if you, as you guys say, if you vote the right people in, maybe they can make those decisions, as we try to struggle with this. But Jesse, you also talked about, you teach government and civics. And do you guys go, when you talk with your students, do you guys go into issues like living wage and how the policies from a government standpoint affect that? Do the kids get it?
So the kids definitely, I don't have to, as a teacher and where I teach, I don't have to teach kids that what's happening economically is unacceptable. I don't have to teach them that. They will recognize that immediately when we have these conversations. We speak, even though, the curriculum for government and civics in this state allows for us to speak about current issues that are affecting us. And that's, generally speaking, how government and civics teachers can really bring these issues into the classroom. But I definitely have lessons that incorporate issues of wage, of wealth gap, of and labor laws, labor practices, things of that nature. And the kids, again, 14 and 15-year-old kids. That's one thing I keep thinking about is if 14 and 15-year-old kids can recognize that this is something that needs to be fixed, I have a really hard time understanding how people who are much older, with much more education, don't understand that that's the case. That they're not really seeking that and doing everything they can to fix this issue. We, as an educator, I can tell you that if a kid is, and many kids are having to help support their families, right? If a kid has having to do that, they don't have the time to go home and study and do homework like kids from more affluent backgrounds get to. If a parent is trying to support their children the best way that they know how in this abysmal labor market in this community and with the wages they are now, then they don't, they're working 2 jobs, 3 jobs. They don't have the time to sit down and help their kid out with homework. They don't have the privilege, there is a privilege, undue privilege, class-wise, when it comes to parents being able to sit down with their children at night, or and read with them, right, at an early age, to have access to those resources, to even have the time and the emotional space and energy to do these things. It's unfair, it's unjust that these things are impacting the performance of many students. Now, having said all that, many of my students they're all wonderful kids. Many of them are pushing through the adversity, but too many aren't able to do that because the deck is stacked against them, and it's not their fault. When it comes to,
that's so important, isn't it?
Yeah,
that last thing, it's not their fault, right? That they're there, and yet they're in this position, and nobody wants to say it's our fault.
Right.
We need to step in now and do something, right? There's that, well, you guys deal with this now. The American way is that you put up your bootstraps and you get to work and you do that. But when you're that far behind, right, there's no way to make that up without having that boost. And I think we see that with Dr. Baradaran's writings and things that you've been saying, Broderick, and others in the community, is that, we have to accept our role, right, in creating this, so that's the first thing that they always teach you in AA meetings, right? Accept that you're the addict, or accept that you are part of this problem, so that then you can go and look for those solutions. And before we go on, I do want to, you touched on education, which I think is so important, because it shows if we had living wages, right, then kids would actually have an advantage in school that they do not have now. Broderick, you mentioned something about health, and being able to have a living wage. One, because usually if you have a living wage, it also means a job that would have health care, health plans for their employees, or at least pay a wage that people can then get health care. Because you mentioned something, and we are the only developed country where people go bankrupt over a medical bill because they just can't pay it, right? And they literally go bankrupt over that. Let's talk a little bit more about living wage and helping in those issues of maybe some preventive stuff for people staying healthy.
Yeah, definitely. Especially with the current climate we have, where social services are being, cut, and different programs are being defunded and whatnot. there's going to be a need to, make up for that gap that we see. And if we aren't figuring out ways to put people to work at decent wages or attracting employers to places like Georgia and local municipalities where people can have a higher wage market, then we're kind of setting ourselves up in the long run, I feel like, for, just more of the same old and recurring cycles of poverty. So we must, we must, like I said, take something, take action and be more proactive and start to focus on ways to address it, from a government standpoint. So
I would also add that when it comes to preventive steps, when it comes in healthcare, if you're not able to buy the food that is going to help to sort of allow you to feed your family in ways that avoids problems associated with obesity or with
diabetes.
Yeah, diabetes, too much sugar, right?
High blood pressure.
Right. If you don't have access, right? If you don't have access to the food, the produce, if you don't have access to these things, you're already at a disadvantage. But if you can actually afford these things, then you can address these things in front. And I've heard repeatedly, and nutritionists will tell you this, that 90% of a healthy life is diet. Is what you put in your body, right? So if a family is unable to access these things, then they're actually setting. Actually, the system is setting the family up for a lower quality of life, but B, more trouble and possibly a shorter lifespan. I would be willing to bet that you would see, and actually, yeah, I've seen the data. There's shorter lifespan, lower quality of life, because people don't have access to the quality and variety of food that they need to have a healthy life. Mm-hmm.
So 2 things. One is there's actually a definition that talks about living wage in terms of housing and food security. Mm-hmm. So, exactly what you were talking about, but also Shannon is reaching us through text. See, we're doing all the tech that we can here.
Yeah, making it happen.
One of the things she wanted to make sure that we address, especially since I'm a state representative, right, is that unfortunately some of Georgia's state laws have sort of made it impossible for local municipalities to raise the minimum wage. These, preemptive kinds of laws that are in place and we have a law that the legislature passed it before I was there. I just want to make that clear, that says that local municipalities cannot raise the minimum wage. And many, municipalities will then come back and say, so our hands are tied, right? Our hands are tied. If you don't change something at the state level, then it's not us, right? And so when Broderick gave that example of him helping the municipal employees out, but there's nothing that we can do in the private sector because the state has done that, right? So something that, a state representatives can do is go back and say, hey, we need to look at this law. Can we change it? Can we take that? And I can tell you right now in the legislature, there's a real struggle between state control and local control. And not just about this issue, but in many issues. And it's been a little surprising to me this session to see that struggle going on. But I'm seeing it in so many bills that are coming out. And one of them is a bail bond bill that preempts all of the local ordinances. So Atlanta had some really progressive bail bonds reform, and this bill might just knock them all out. And I think that's a dangerous precedent, right? That we have to go back to that. So that's definitely something that I hope with myself, Representative Fry, and Representative Wallace to go back and bring these issues up of this preemption and see what can we do, right? The 3 of us alone can't do it. We need to have that support from other representatives, but definitely the idea of making sure we have these conversations, making sure that people are hearing us. So please share these conversations. Don't think, okay, we talked about it and that's it. It's all done. But, talk about these things with your colleagues, because one of the reasons for these forums is how many times that we don't talk about these important issues with our families, with our friends, right?
And I failed to mention earlier too, I went to the state capitol to lobby for the first time a few weeks ago with Athens for Everyone. And I was able to speak to Senator Frank Ginn, who's a representative senator in my area district. And I was lobbying actually for a living wage that day. And I was telling him like the importance of families being able to provide for themselves and their kids, and how if you work a certain number of hours a week, you should be able to provide those basic necessities, from housing, food, and shelter and clothing and things of that nature. And his response was something along the lines of just people have to kind of go through things and work their way up, over time, or, something along those lines. And, I appreciate him for coming out to speak with us, because a lot of times they don't even come out to the rope sometimes. So I do appreciate him coming out. But it's people going to the state capitol and staying in their face and on their radar and advocating for these things like we're talking about, having these conversations, and really demanding that we do create a plan, to address the wage issue that we have, the depressed wages that people are struggling to live and to exist in our society. So,
yeah. And it's interesting that you mentioned that story about Frank Ginn, because I have a seatmate, Representative Doreen Carter. And I just love her, because every once in a while she'll just give these snide little remarks. And she showed me an article that got published today that said, and I'm going to quote you the headline, Congressional Republicans claim $450,000 a year is the middle class. Now, I don't know anybody who would consider themselves middle class that is making almost $500,000 a year, right? When the U.S. household income of $150,000 a year is considered top 10% of all earners. So that 450 has to be what? Top 1% of the top 2% of that. And I think, when we look at that, I think it's important to take note of those kinds of numbers, because I think it tells us the perspective from which they come, right? If they're considering that middle class, then we are all in poverty, and they don't understand what's really going on within their own districts. And so that is something definitely to be aware of. But Broderick, and Jesse took his students to the Capitol on Monday. And I just think it's so important for people to go, to experience that, to see that representatives are normal people like them, but we are given, some advantages of that, where they're voting on these laws, and having the voices heard, the messages heard. So I encourage everybody to go and visit. We do end session next Thursday. So it's Tuesday and Thursday that you have a chance to really go and see everything this session, but there'll be more every year after that, because it just happens again and again and again. Avery, do we have any other questions coming up?
We just have like 53 people watching. We've got several that have come on and off.
Okay.
The big thing is, again, I think there's been some discussion here from people that have been messaging, like privately messaging, just making sure that people understand the role that the government has had in suppressing this. So for instance, if the minimum wage simply kept up with inflation, the federal minimum wage should be $11 an hour. But if it actually kept up with U.S. productivity, it should be $18 an hour.
And we didn't even talk about inflation, right? When we look at this number of 2001, 515, in today's world, that value is so much less.
And that's with no kids too, right? That's with no kids, 0 children.
That's just what the minimum wage period should be.
Right.
If you look at the history of this country, I mean, government has been controlled by people who have power and affluence already, right? Historically speaking. So from the very beginning, you had people trying to like get as much as they could off the backs of other people in this country, and not even considering some people as people in this country. So, and getting labor laws fair, like just getting a minimum wage on the books was a battle, right? And this is a continuation of that. Clearly, government has a role in this, and people, and it matters who we put in government, right? They have the power. People in government have the power to change this. We don't have to live this way, but people are actively choosing to keep it this way. And I think it goes a lot to what you said about not understanding what's even like to be in that situation for a lot of people. And also, it's important to point out when it comes to Georgia and localities, for example, yes, the state level prohibits us from doing what we can here locally, but not all states do that, right? Seattle was able to raise their minimum wage there. So, and in Washington, in California, Los Angeles was able to raise their minimum wage. So really, I mean, the state legislature can help, right? They can help us enable localities to do what they think is best for their communities, and you mentioned how there's a tug of war, there's over control over a lot of these issues, state to local. I've been under the impression that conservative principle is local control, right? So if you've got a predominantly Republican legislature trying to control what the localities do, that goes against the principle of conservatism. So I'm having the only thing that I can see that's driving this is a desire for profit. It's not really about values, about caring for people and about doing what's right by the people. It's about giving into special interests and giving into corporations and people who already have, rather than taking care of the people and not even taking care of, enabling people to pursue the highest quality of life that they're capable of.
Yeah, and I think, there's often this conversation of, there's plenty of opportunity. But I think what we can also see as a truth is that not everybody has the same access to those opportunities, right? And I think that is where we can see that it is systemic. And because it is systemic, government has to accept its role in creating the problem and also its responsibility in helping to solve it, right? And so I was just given this stat in the MIT study. In Athens, Georgia, a living wage for a family of 4, 2 adults, 2 kids, is $61,000 a year. Okay, that's what it should be at least.
Right.
But the median income, the actual median income, is less than $33,000 a year. I mean, that's almost 50% that we are off. And realistically saying you're 50% off, how do you do that on your own, right? The things were put in place so that there was this discrepancy. How do we do that on our own? So in the last few minutes that we have left, let's talk about some potential solutions. What are we seeing? I mean, one obviously is the one that we're talking about here, the living wage, right? We need to get those up because we see that it has a real economic benefit to everybody involved, not just the person who's earning that, but to the family, the kids, which means then if those kids are more educated and they graduate, they get into the STEM areas, for example, they get higher wages, that's going to be better, higher taxes, right? And again, those taxes are taken and then they're paid into it as well. What else can we do?
So part of it for me, and I just learned about a lot of this. I don't know much about unions, but unionizing, controlling or not controlling, but bringing back that balance of power between employee and employer. That's one solution. And creating a policy and legislation around those relationships, and making sure that because unions are a way for employees to really get together, organize, and advocate, especially if they feel like they're being mistreated in any way, especially with the wage part, because at the end of the day, an institution or corporation or business, they're trying to maximize the profits. They're looking out for the interests of the corporation or the business and the stakeholders, those shareholders. And we know as a business owner myself, I mean, overhead, is like paying employees and renting the space. That's some of the largest, parts of the overhead. But in order for, I guess, people to really be able to make a living wage that work for these larger employers, you have to have some type of equal ground or equal footing where they can kind of negotiate for those better terms, better wages, healthcare, all those things. So that's a potential solution in my mind, and just things along that line.
And we have a new union forming,
Right.
the UGA union,
yeah.
right? And I know that,
Mm-hmm.
Speaking with some of them, one of the things that they're facing is that Georgia is an at-will state, right? In terms of, work.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to be interesting to see that come out.
Yeah.
Getting back to education, Jesse, and you, I know that I've been getting a lot of negative feedback from constituents who are really upset about educational funding.
I was just about to say that. I'm so glad you brought
talk
that.
about that.
The state of Georgia, first of all, their formula for QBE, which is what they've had in place for far too long, to determine the amount of funding that they're even going to allow to be put into our public education system, it's insufficient in and of itself. The amount of funding is, and this is not Jesse Evans speaking. This is GBPI speaking. These are people policy analysts who this is GAE. These are, so it's insufficient in and of itself what they're even allowed to do. But to make matters worse, we are underfunding our public education system $167 million. We are in the hole, like negatively, like we don't have. They're underfunding like less than 167 million of what they're even allowed to do. And this is what blows my mind is there was a windfall, unexpected due to federal changes in tax laws, and instead of using this money to fully fund our education system, there are people in the legislature who and the governor decided to basically do away with that opportunity, pass that opportunity by, and continue underfunding our education system. So we have to change QBE funding to begin, like the formula, but we also have to, do what is like fully fund it to like whatever is there, we have to fully fund it. I mean, you've got an issue with classroom sizes. We've got kids like classrooms of between 30 and 35 kids. And anybody that knows anything about education knows that the smaller the class size, the more the learning that takes place. And the way you do that is you have more teachers employed.
So let me transition there with the teachers, right? Because part of this conversation is also, are teachers making a living wage, right? They are not getting a raise. We talk about COLAs or life adjustments, inflation adjustments with some of these things. And, if a teacher who is underpaid, right, and then they can't even support their family, and yet they're going out and they're buying supplies for their students, right? I think is something else to look at. And also, so in the Working Families Caucus this week, they had a very interesting conversation looking at education, but from a workforce development, looking at adults, for example, GED programs, getting adults to be able to get their GED programs, technical programs. Now, there used to be quite a comprehensive, from what I understand, vocational or career paths in high schools here that has been sort of narrowed down a little bit. I've heard Dr. Means talk about he'd like to bring some of that back. Do you think that could help in terms of the living wage if we can give those skills?
Yeah, I think that there is underemployment in the technical fields, and I know for a fact that there are kids that I teach that would love to have access to these opportunities to learn these skills. And you can come out of a technical or vocational school making significantly more than most of the kids that the families where the kids that I teach are coming from. And that's just like an immediate boost in quality of life. And so I fully agree that is a priority and that's something that needs to be changed. And also Dr. Means understands this as well, and this is a priority for him. I really want to just stress, this is not like a for now issue. This is like something that's been going on for a while now. And if my 14 and 15-year-old students at Cedar Shores High School, when I took them to the state capitol, we spoke to Cecily of Public Education Matters Georgia, and she was speaking about the underfunding issue here. And like, again, they're 14 and 15, and they know that I asked them, I said, hey guys, what situation are you gonna learn in better? A larger class or smaller class? Like each smaller class. Okay, well, how does that happen? You need more teachers. So like they get it. They can, if they can connect the dots, then it's anybody that's in the legislature right now that says that they don't agree with that. Like I would question their authenticity. I would question their sincerity. I would question why it is that they're there to begin with, honestly.
So Broderick, you want to add to this about what other things that we can do?
Yeah, definitely. Well, one of the things I wanted to point out too was like after the Athens Clarke County local government raised their minimum wage for their full-time employees, what happened was other institutions and other larger employers started to look at their employee pay scales, and a couple of them did raise the floor a little bit, but it's still not to a place where it's not enough. They could have done more, I feel like, and a lot of people feel like that. So I think one of those people were the hospital. I think they're the second or third largest employer here. The school district, for some of their employees, they raised some of those areas that they had adjustments, I think, for the bus drivers and stuff like that. And
so you think it could be like a movement?
I think so.
If we start in one thing, then other businesses, because you often hear one of the biggest complaints is we can't give everybody a raise because then we're going to go out of business because we just can't afford it.
Right.
But studies have said that no, that does not happen. That big layoff really does not happen in that.
The University of Georgia, the largest employer we have in this community, they employ over like 10,000, here in this community. They should be leading that charge. I feel like they should be at the table, just like trying to figure out how they can bring about more adequate wages for their entry-level employees.
Yeah,
and I've heard it put this way as well. As you said, it's a myth that paying a living wage is going to force small businesses to close their doors. Most small businesses, they wouldn't be like that, especially if they're a mature small business 10 years in, 10 years in. But also, I ask myself, if a business model is dependent upon exploiting somebody, like keeping them in poverty, keeping their children in poverty, perpetuating generational poverty, is that a business model that we find acceptable? And my answer personally is no, it's not. Right. Like, if that's your business model, you need to change your business model, right? I mean, that's unacceptable.
And I think we're seeing some of that. These benefit companies, these social benefit companies, like Zombie Donuts, right? You go there, they give you a token, and they say vote for a nonprofit, and we're going to give a part of our profit, right, to that nonprofit. I think we're seeing, especially, I think in Athens has a certain mentality, or with that. But I don't tend to buy into this idea that it's profit or nothing.
Right.
Right. My idea is more, businesses have a responsibility to the environment and the community that they're part of. And I think that's why living wages just makes good business sense.
Absolutely. And the cooperative model. If you have the cooperative model where employees are actually, like the workers actually take part in ownership and they have a say and they can steer the company. There are successful cooperatives across this country, and one in this community, Peachy Green Cleaning, they're like, the wages are higher, the working conditions are better, and everybody is working together, and the business is succeeding, and you don't and including the management, right? Everybody is living at a living wage or better, right? And that's, to me, that's a no-brainer. And it's being done not just here with that business, but across the country.
So it can work.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, and I think that's the biggest message, is that it can actually work.
And it's also been proven, sorry to cut you off, but it's also been proven too that when you pay people better, that you retain your employees. They're more willing, apt to stay around, because that means that you value them to a certain degree, when you pay them better, especially when you pay them a living wage. $15 or higher.
So I'm going to give you guys
Sure.
a last opportunity to say a closing statement while we get a last question. Okay? So Jesse?
So just to piggyback off that, in Louisville, Kentucky, where I was going for undergrad, I worked in the hospitality industry, and that the business, the owner, they believed in what you just said, and they were paying me. I left there making $11 an hour. I started at close to $10 an hour, and it was working. They were expanding and growing, not just in Louisville, but beyond there. When I came here with 4 years experience and leaving an $11 an hour job, when I came here for grad school, a local hotel said that all they could offer me was minimum wage here, which blew my mind. It was minimum wage or nothing. So I just moved right along. But for as far as a closing statement goes, just like our EJC Economic Justice Coalition, our mission, our passion, what we do, we educate, we advocate, and we organize for economic justice. And the more people that understand, that are educated about this issue, that the more people that are taking a stand against exploitation and taking a stand for economic justice, and the more people that are working together, organized together, and participating in the political system, the more likely we are to achieve this sooner. So, I would strongly encourage people to, whatever you can do and in whatever way, get involved, learn about it. Actually, Avery has some great resources about the issue that hopefully he'll share with people. That'd be great.
Yeah.
That would be awesome.
Broderick?
Yeah, and for me, again, I want to say thanks for having me being a part of this conversation. But I think that's one of the things that's key: keeping workers' rights, workers' issues, workers' advocacy, labor rights as part of the narrative. If you're running for office or if you're in office and you're not coming up with solutions and plans to help address some of those things, then I think you should not be holding that position, because it affects so many people. So there needs to be proper things in place for people to be advocating for that, elected officials and those running for office. That should be a part of their platform or their narrative in some way. Like I said, because it affects so many people. And I want to leave you, I guess, with something Dr. King was saying. I can't remember what speech he said it in. But he was saying something along the lines of, if somebody is working a full-time job, it's criminal. Actually, he said it's criminal for somebody to be working a full-time job for part-time pay.
Yeah.
And that, just resonated with me and stuck with me, because I was in that position where I was working full-time, but I was making like $11,000 a year, $12,000. And this is out of college with a degree. It took me a while to find adequate employment. And even when I did find an entry-level position, I was still, even by myself as a single male, I was still living at or below the poverty line. So that was my personal experience. And I know that's the story of many, many other Georgians, Athenians.
Still today.
Every day, because we have a unemployment rate here locally in Georgia of about 4%. But we have a poverty rate, or there was just a report put out by Envision Athens that says nearly 40% of the youth growing up in this community in Athens experience poverty on some level. 40%. That's almost half of the kids growing up in our community experiencing poverty. Like that just blows my mind. Like there needs to be some serious things that take place to address that on a local level, state level, and all of that. So.
And federal level.
Yes.
I think, as we summarize this to come to a close, unfortunately, we always run out of time with these Friday forums. But as I said, these, for me, are the starting conversations. I mean, as a state representative, I don't have all the answers. Yeah. That's why I need to get with thought leaders and community leaders and the experers to help come up with.
Expert,
I consider you definitely a community leader, or Dr. Baradaran, or the Economic Justice Coalition, or Jobs with Justice. These people who have been studying these things and know what to put into place, so that then I know what to do as the state representative to get this. Because I think out of this conversation, two things that we need to make very clear. One is that government has a role in the solution because government had a role
And create
in the problem. And we need to
Yes.
take that accountability, right? So that we can accept the responsibility and move on to solutions. But two, and this sort of came out at the very end, but I think it's really important that we understand that living wages is essential to our conversation of poverty. And as uncomfortable as that word may be for so many people, we are talking about trying to alleviate poverty. And when we do that, there are so many benefits to the community itself. I mean, the reliance on public assistance goes down. Student achievement goes up. Health benefits that go up. Suicide goes down. Depression goes down. There are so many benefits that go when we address this. But until we do, right, we can't sort of try to sidestep this. We can't sort of say, it's not my issue, that somebody else has to take care of it. We all have to come together at all the levels, the community, the local, the state, the federal officials. We did this all together. We need to help our people get out of that as we do this. So thank you so much to my panelists, Broderick Flanagan, Jesse Evans, Shannon Reese from Jobs with Justice, who has been talking to us through the text and all of that. Want to thank all of you for spending some of your time on this Friday evening talking about living wages. And remember, we will come back to this topic because this is far from over until we have some real solutions in place. We look forward to your comments. If you have resources, we'll be putting out some of our own that you've heard us mention here. But if you have organizations, if you have resources, if you have ideas of what we can do, and if you want to get involved, please reach out. I am your state representative of House District 117, Deborah Gonzalez, saying thank you and God bless you tonight. Bye-bye.